So in this video, what I want to talk about is diabetes, what it is and what causes it. Before we can do that though, we need to talk about the types of diabetes because what they are and how they work depends on the type. There's three types of diabetes: type 1, type 2, and gestational diabetes. Most of the diabetes that we see in the United States is type 2 diabetes. Gestational diabetes is, in some ways, a type 2 diabetes that is triggered only when women are pregnant. Because it acts in the same way as type 2 diabetes, many people lump together gestational and type 2, and if you do that, it works out then that there's two types, type 1 and type 2, which sometimes type 2 is triggered during gestation. And 90% then of the diabetes in the United States is type 2. So let's talk about how the two different types of diabetes work. In type 1 diabetes, the insulin that you have and can produce from your pancreas is not enough to complete the job. So the way that blood glucose regulation works is that in order for the glucose to get from the bloodstream into fat or muscle cells, it has to go through transporters. There are some transporters that are sort of always there, and they let in a small amount of basal glucose, even without insulin. But the bulk of the glucose that gets into the cell gets in through this type of receptor transporter, which is called the GLUT4. The GLUT4 receptor is said to be insulin activated. What happens is when insulin is released, it binds to these receptors that are on the membranes of the cells. And when the insulin interacts with them, that causes these receptors to modify the GLUT4 transporter so that it is now open and glucose can flow through it. So with type 1 diabetes, there is not enough of that insulin around, and so even though there's plenty of glucose present, which should normally turn on the insulin, it never gets inside the cell. In type 2 diabetes, there's no problem with making insulin. In fact, some people with type 2 diabetes will have hyperinsulinemia, so they make too much insulin. So when glucose is in the bloodstream, the insulin is produced and it responds, and but what happens is when the insulin binds to the receptors, the part here that activates that GLUT4 transporter is defective, it's broken. And so even though there's plenty of glucose, plenty of insulin, the amount of glucose that gets in the cell is diminished. And what happens with type 2 diabetes is it starts out where you have insulin production is made, so they're making normal amounts of insulin. But then when the cell senses that the amount of insulin that is being made is not enough to lower blood glucose, it will start to make more insulin. And so what you see is actually an increase in the amount of insulin in the bloodstream of diabetics. And this period of time here where you have increased blood sugars and increased insulin levels in the bloodstream is called prediabetes, or also called insulin resistance, a period of insulin resistance. When diabetes is diagnosed, what happens over time is that the insulin production actually begins to decline. So at that point, what's happening is that people are making more and more insulin, but then at some point it starts to look like type 1 diabetes in that they don't make enough insulin. And at this point, people with type 2 diabetes may end up getting insulin injections, just like people with type 1. This process, though, takes about 10 to 30 years. So the point at which insulin production delays, if it happens to you late enough in life, this part, you may never see this part of the curve where you actually need insulin. So other differences between type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is considered to be a young person's diabetes. The average age of onset is about 16. Compared to type 2, this is something that happens later in life, although more and more we are seeing young people coming down with type 2 diabetes, even children. Another key difference is how it's treated. So type 1 diabetes is irreversible. Once you have it, you have to have insulin injections for the rest of your life. Type 2, on the other hand, with diet and exercise, if you catch it earlier enough, you can actually reverse it and avoid having insulin injections altogether. Type 1 is not as genetically, doesn't have as much of a genetic component as with type 2. The percentage comes from twin studies. So if you have identical twins, the probability that your identical twin will have type 1 diabetes is about 50%, whereas for the same twins who have type 2 diabetes, 60 to 80% chance that your identical twin will have it too. Okay. A key difference is where this diabetes comes from. So it's thought that where type 1 diabetes comes from is that when you're young, your immune system is developing. And over time, as you become infected with various viruses and get exposed to antigen, your T cells learn what is foreign and what is you. And in that process of educating the T cells, if you get an infection that looks like your something that's on the surface of your pancreatic cells, then you train the immune system to recognize your pancreatic beta cells, the ones that secrete insulin, as foreign. And so after the infection is over and the immune system has learned that this virus is foreign, it will start to attack your pancreatic beta cells. And over time, they will shut down. So it's sort of an autoimmune self-destruction of your own system triggered by an infection. If, on the other hand, you can pass through that window of T-cell education without getting infected by the particular type of virus, then your pancreatic beta cells will survive it, your immune system will mature, and it will know that your pancreatic cells belong there. Type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, its cause is unknown. Although, as you'll see, that's the reason that it's unknown, is because there's a lot of factors that play in, some of them environmental and some of them genetic. It is a complex disease. So let's start by talking about type 2 diabetes and the genes. In all, there are 20 different genes that have been found where people who have the disease, type 2 diabetes, are more likely to have a variant of one of these particular genes. And if you have this many genes, then there's a pretty good chance that you may have one, at least one, where the allele is defective. In addition, when you look at the distribution of these alleles in the population in general, 10 to 90% of the population in the United States has at least one of these risk-correlated alleles. And that's what comes from this column. Furthermore, if you have that allele, the risk of your coming down with type 2 diabetes is elevated anywhere from 9% to 70%. So from this number alone, there's a probability that you will have the allele, but then in addition to that, once you have the allele, there's still a great deal of variation as to whether you will come down with it or not. And so that explains why it's such a head-scratcher. All right, another clue as to what causes diabetes is to look at the incidence of a disease over time. Now, if a disease is genetic, if it's inborn, then what you should see is you should see a constant rate. All right, and you do see that with type 1 diabetes. Now, I said that type 1 diabetes is only about 50% genetic, but the frequency with which people come down with these various infections that are thought to stimulate the type 1 diabetes has been constant. There has not been big epidemics of it. So that's pretty constant. What this graph shows is the history. So this is 1980 to 2011, the percent of the people in the United States who have these various types, who have diabetes in total. And it's broken down by age group because we know that type 1 diabetes primarily strikes young people, so that's one way to separate them out. And another way to look at it is that since our population at large is getting older, and since type 2 diabetes strikes older people, it's possible that increases in diabetes might be due to the general aging of the population. But what you can see is that if you look at these various age groups, okay, the current baby boomers are in this group right now. If you look at it broken down by age, you can see that for all age groups, the amount of the incidence of diabetes has been going up since about 1990. Okay, when you see an increase like that for all of these age groups, there's only one explanation for that, and that is some environmental change since about 1990. So one way to try to figure out what is that environmental factor is to do some epidemiological studies and look at what are the risk factors for type 2 diabetes for those who have it compared to those who don't. What do those who have it have in common, which those that don't have? So here's the list. Family history of diabetes, that's genetics. If you are overweight and inactive, you are more likely to have type 2 diabetes. It's age-related. There are some ethnic groups in the United States that have higher levels of it, which is also partly genetic and partly lifestyle. Gestational diabetes, of course, but then there's some dietary things. So high cholesterol, high blood pressure, which for some people is caused by high sodium in the diet, and low fiber and high glycemic index diets. Okay. So in that list, these factors, overweight, inactive, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and low fiber, high GI diets, all of those are environmental factors. And of these, the incidence of obesity and inactivity has increased recently. And so that correlates well with the increase that we're seeing in type 2 diabetes. So putting this all together, here is the current model that puts together what causes type 2 diabetes. So you start with 3 factors that make you overweight. Too much food, and in particular, too much animal fat, because animal fat is saturated fat, and also because it has a high caloric content. So our food has become more fatty. Not enough exercise, and also some of the genes that have been tied to type 2 diabetes have been shown to affect your appetite. So if you've got the hungry gene in combination with not enough exercise and too much and a change in diet, that makes you more likely to be overweight. All right, not all people who are overweight come down with type 2 diabetes. So another risk factor is if you have genes that cause insulin resistance. So the combination from these two is your body becomes more resistant to the amount of insulin that you have. So as a result of insulin resistance, okay, if you have the right genes, then the insulin resistance starts to wear out the pancreatic cells, so they're pumping out more insulin, and that starts to cause problems with them. Another thing that can happen is if you are overweight, then fat can accumulate in your pancreas, and that can also be a factor in the loss of the ability of the beta cells to produce insulin. So the end result is if all of these factors come to play, then you end up with type 2 diabetes.